Hope everyone had a good networking break. Welcome to the third panel of today on advancing the climate discourse, smart routines seat at the climate table. Before I start with the session, I'd like to take a moment to thank our title and key sponsors. We have a fantastic ingredient players across all categories, spanning the gamut of proteins, flavors, spices, all the excellent things that we need to make great tasting next generation foods. We have co-development players, infrastructure and equipment manufacturers, really anyone who can help you develop, launch, and scale your smart routine dreams. We've worked very closely with each of the companies over the last few years, and they've been integral to the groundswell of entrepreneurship we are currently seeing in the smart routine space. We're grateful to AK, ADM, Cornell, Griffith Foods, IFF, Reliance Industries, Sun NutriFoods, Seneca, and VKL for their partnership and support in the sector. In this session, we will talk about how alternative proteins are gradually getting mainstreamed into the broader landscape of climate mitigation. Industrialized animal agriculture is in the top two, three more significant contributors to the world's most pressing environmental issues, such as water use, air pollution, and loss of biodiversity. Industrialized animal agriculture is responsible for 14 to 18% of greenhouse gas emissions, and that's a higher share than the entire transport sector. 75% of agricultural land is used for raising and feeding livestock, yet only provides one third of the total global protein supply. But we know, of course, like regardless of all these data points that I just talked about, that meat demand is set to rise till 2050. We have a jump of 70%, and that's mainly driven by countries such as India and China. And that means that if this data is any indication of our future, the way we produce, manufacture, and distribute our food will significantly shape our planetary health and, by extension, our future. The most severe impacts of this climate change would be felt disproportionately by underserved and marginalized population, and thus understanding how agriculture and the foods industry impact our planet and more specifically vulnerable regions is a key part of the climate conversation and the identification of solutions. Of course, all of this is changing because key investors such as Bill Gates, Richard Branson, Sergey Brin, and celebrities such as Leonardo DiCaprio even are endorsing alternative proteins as a key climate investment target. The larger investment community now is, of course, slowly taking notice. But we need a broad cluster of support interventions to build capacity in this sector, greater awareness, and advocacy of impact metrics to communicate the importance of climate proofing food systems. To take this conversation forward and offer a perspective into what is needed to get alternative proteins the fair chance it deserves in climate mitigation plans, we have three fantastic speakers who have deep expertise in building partnerships and funneling investment towards climate based technologies. I'm personally very excited to welcome the speakers today. We have Claire Everhart, who serves as a Director of Relationships for the new US International Development Finance Corporation, where she liaises with financial institutions across Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa to increase access to finance through the leveraging of local private capital. Prior to working for the DFC, Claire served in a similar role with USAID's Development Credit Authority. Welcome to the panel, Claire. We have Maya Chandrasekharan, who's co-founder and managing partner, Green Artha Innovation. She also co-founded and continues to actively run the 200 plus member Women in Investing Network. She was also a founding member of Mentera Venture Advisors and was part of the founding leadership that scaled babajob.com into India's largest tech-enabled livelihoods platform. Maya's prior experience includes being an early team member of Janalakshmi, which is one of India's largest urban MFIs, and working with CapVent Fund of Funds. Welcome to the panel, Maya.
Thanks, Artha.
And we have Stephanie Stein, who oversees the day-to-day work of GFI's international operations to expand its impact internationally. Previously, Stephanie spent 2 decades building strategic partnerships and managing international teams and programs across the private and nonprofit sectors. An Asia specialist, she founded and ran the Asian Waterkeeper Network for Waterkeeper Alliance. Thank you so much for joining us at this ungodly hour for you, Stephanie and Claire both. I know it's 5:30 your time, so really appreciate you taking out the time to be on this panel. And finally, we have Varun, who has graciously agreed to also join this panel. He couldn't really wait to join the rest of us because of the conversations that we were going to have. Welcome,
Welcome
Varun,
again.
again.
I'm having way too much fun. Thank you so much. That's why I've joined here.
Great, let's get the conversation started. We'll start with a round of questions, just framing the challenge of what the climate issues that present itself and how smart routine is looking like within that. We'll start with Stephanie. Stephanie, you work out of GFI US with the international network of GFI organizations, and you have a background in the development sector, including clean water. Would you please underline for us the challenge here? Why is smart routine critical to center in the broader climate landscape?
Sure. Well, good morning, good evening, everyone. It's a pleasure to be on this panel and to speak a little bit about alternative proteins as a climate solution and a water pollution, air pollution solution. We talk a lot about all of the data, and I can share some of that with you. We have gathered statistics from separate life cycle analyses that were conducted by some of the major or the leading alternative protein companies, Beyond Meat, Morningstar Farms, and Possible Foods, and synthesize that data into some tables. And I would like to share some of that with you now. So if we replace, these life cycle analyses have concluded that if we replace conventional meat with plant-based meat, we can reduce greenhouse gas emissions by 86% and land use by 96%, water use by 96%, air pollution by 93%, and toxic chemicals by 83%. So that's just on the plant-based side. We also are looking, of course, at cultivated meat. And in that case, cultivated meat replacing animal meat consumption would reduce land use by 95%, greenhouse gas emissions by 92%, 78% less water, 93% less air pollution, and 92% less toxic chemicals. So these are all of these statistics I'm citing are from very rigorous life cycle analyses. The second one with cultivated meat was a study out of CE Delft in the Netherlands. It was a very rigorous study taking data from 15 different cultivated meat startups. And so it's based on actual industry knowledge and not just speculation. So with all of that, all of those great stats, I think it's obvious that we ought to be looking seriously at alternative proteins as a key climate and pollution solution. Do you have, may I elaborate on any of that?
Yes, please.
That's great. I think we would love to understand, how this relates to your background. You've had a background in terms of working at Waterkeeper Alliance, and this has a deep, I think, you have a deeper motivation to be in this sector to work towards climate mitigation. So would love to understand that perspective as well as to what drives you towards this sector and work in it more broadly.
Oh, wonderful. Well, as you know, I'm an Asia specialist, but China is my specific area of expertise. And China, as everyone knows, is the largest GHG emitter. And they also suffer from very extreme water pollution problems. So, and given that China is set to be or on track to be one of the largest consumers of meat, we need to look very carefully at how we might, bring solutions to countries like China that already have these dire problems. And if I were to place myself back in China in 10 years ago when I was very actively working there, and I was to say how important this solution is to China, I would say that anything that we can do to improve the water pollution and air pollution problems in China would be most welcome. So that's and that is what drove me to work there, is the severity of the pollution problems in China. And that's so, just like for everywhere else in the world, this is specifically important for countries like China.
Absolutely, and I think we'll talk about that a little bit later as well, as to why it's more important for emerging economies to really focus on that, because the at least for India, the effects of climate change would be felt more deeply for vulnerable populations here. So it's important that we look at food systems more broadly. We look at what are the main contributors towards climate change for these regions. I'll move on to Maya now. A similar question, Maya, for you, but zooming in on India. Firstly, could you underline for us why climate change is overall a critical issue for India? Could you tell us a little bit about your work and especially the recent landscaping you carried out of the climate space in the country? What emerged as key priorities to which the ecosystem is directing attention, and how does this compare with the international climate discourse?
Sure. Thanks for that, Satvika. Apologies, I had a little bit of an internet fluctuation, so I hope I'm now audible to everyone. Just as a quick background, earlier in the year, my firm Green Artha partnered with Ashoka Social Innovators, and we undertook what ended up being quite a large climate ecosystem mapping for, really to understand the state of affairs in India. And our broad sort of parameters or axes were, what will it take to get climate action at scale, at speed, and equitably in India to meet our planetary goals? And obviously, as you can imagine, smart proteins were one part of the conversation, and I'll call out, specifically where they came up. But at an overall level, I think four very clear drivers or levers of action emerged, and these can be applied equally, to smart protein. But at the very high level, the four levers that were identified were data, technology, and protocols as being sort of key levers to enable people to be able to share information. I think critically what people called out, especially from the India perspective, was not just does data need to be shared, data needs to be owned in a collaborative manner by communities. Communities need to be able to operate and have agency with data, and it needs to flow from one area to the other. The other area that emerged as a key lever is communications. And I think this will come out again and again, especially when we think about smart proteins, which is that it is really critical for us to be able to talk about why we're doing what we're doing, and to really build a very strong narrative. This is something that the climate space especially has not done very well. We focused very much either on the science or on sort of the scary stories. We haven't been able to really link the science to what happens every day in our lives, and how that can really be both impactful and how, as individuals, we have agency. Here, I think I want to just pause and quickly call out that this is probably going to be a key lever for the smart protein space. Really, the combination of data science, but really simplifying that and making that accessible and digestible in a sense. And then the other lever, obviously, is climate finance. This is, in India specifically, climate finance is still relatively nascent. It's an enormous gap. There are a lot of, I would say there is relatively more activity around some spaces, such as energy and now mobility. And there are, I think, learnings that we can take from that for some of the earlier, more nascent stages. And but apart from that, there are large gaps across the ecosystem. There's a gap when it comes to early stage. There are gaps in terms of the continuum of funding, collaborations of funding. All of these, I think, still need to be built up. And then finally, I think the piece that comes out very strongly in India, and the reason I kept this last is because you had asked me to call out where maybe there's a little bit of a difference in the climate discourse. And this is something that is a little bit different when we think about, sort of more established economies. The very big focus right now in India is obviously how can we make this transition equitable and just. When we talk about anything that is a radical transformation, there will be obviously people who are impacted. Specific to smart proteins, agriculture is obviously the largest sector of employment in India. And when we are advocating for a change in sort of behaviors and practices, I think the most important thing to be thought about and to be considered is how does everyone get taken forward in that conversation? How do we ensure that livelihoods are impacted positively, and everyone is able to really see the benefits from the transformation that we need?
Thank you so much for that, Maya. I think smart routine itself is giving us this opportunity to build a better future, to ensure that we have inclusion as a key piece of that model that we're trying to build, ensure that we are accessing the all bases and all levels of the socioeconomic pyramid. And all the points that you mentioned are great things for companies, really all the players who are operating in this space, to keep in mind as they're playing an active role in the entire landscape. So thanks for that. I'll move on to Claire now. Claire, the US Development Finance Corporation and the broader sphere of development finance institutions has played a pivotal role in job creation and infrastructure development globally. Where does climate figure in your set of priorities? And would you please outline for the audience what kinds of investments have you made in climate?
Thank you for that question, and so glad to be here. I'm pleased to say that climate change is a very core part of the DFC's development strategy. The DFC has committed to focusing at least 33% of all new investments on climate-related projects beginning in fiscal year 2023, and to achieving net zero emissions across our entire global portfolio by 2040. To date, most of our climate-related investments have focused on the renewable energy space, with an active portfolio of more than 5 billion, which represents about 15% of our total portfolio and 75% of our total energy generation portfolio. And these renewable investments have included a lot of larger utility scale projects, as well as smaller mini grids and off-grid solutions for more remote populations. And we've done quite a few of those in India specifically. And globally, we've financed projects in solar and wind, geothermal, hydro, biomass. Most of these investments have been in the form of direct debt, which has been our bread and butter for many years. When we were previously the Overseas Private Investment Corporation, or OPIC, and where I come from, a smaller office in USAID, the Development Credit Authority, these two merged together to form the Development Finance Corporation. And historically, OPIC focused on loans and the DCA focused on guarantees. So those have been most of our investments thus far. But the DFC and OPIC historically can also provide political risk insurance. And so some of those are in this space as well. When the DFC was created in 2019, we're very new. We were also given equity authority for the first time, which is something that neither of the previous two agencies had the ability to deploy. So we're very excited to have this new tool, and we think it could be very crucial in the climate finance space, particularly with smart proteins, to get a little more early stage than we typically can, and hopefully grow that piece of our climate portfolio, which is currently very, very small. We really hope to grow that.
Great. Thank you so much for laying out that landscape of how it's looking like from a DFC perspective, and how you're thinking about climate broadly, and the potential that it can have for smart protein as well. Let's dive a little bit deeper into how we can center smart protein within the climate discourse. Stephanie, can you talk about the work that GFI's global network is doing to advance smart protein as a climate mitigation solution, and how much progress has been made? Of course, I know a lot is being done by GFI all the time. Globally, different affiliates are doing different things. But more and more, it's becoming a part of the climate conversations that we're having. So would love for you to talk about how we're looking at this, the different things that we've been a part of or are hoping to lead, and what progress has been made.
Sure. Yeah. So we are a global organization and we have affiliates across 5 regions outside of the United States. And it is truly astounding the amount of work that our affiliates do in this sector. And so while I sit atop the international side, it's extremely hard to stay on top of all the work that we're doing. So I will inevitably leave some pieces out. But I would say that the biggest activities, that climate related activities that we're involved in are first with the Aim for Climate initiative that the United States and the UAE announced last spring, which is a commitment for countries to significantly increase their investment in innovation, in climate smart agriculture and sustainable food production. So the UAE and the United States announced that last spring. They are asking other countries to join in this initiative. So far, there are 30 countries signed on. And we recently had the opportunity to meet with some very high level officials in the United States to present a proposal for alternative proteins to be a significant part of Aim for Climate. And we've got 50 signatories, including 27 large companies and a number of very high profile organizations globally that have signed on to our letter asking for the Aim for Climate leadership to consider alternative proteins as a solution and to commit, I think it's $11 billion per year to alternative protein research and development. We presented that at a high level meeting last week in Glasgow, and we hope that work bears fruit. In addition to that, we had a team member being a very key part of Action Track 2 of the UN Food Systems Summit. The UN Food Systems Summit was the first summit, a multilateral summit that was devoted to food systems, as food systems were addressed as a very large contributor to climate change during those talks. And our contribution to that was that our team member led the innovation side of Action Track 2, which had to do with shifting to sustainable consumption patterns. So it was really rewarding to see food systems emissions being addressed at the multilateral level for really the first time, because food systems emissions have been relatively neglected in the major climate negotiations that have taken place to date. So we were very happy to see that initiative actually happened. And we hope that the proposals that we made as part of that process will be taken forward at the multilateral level. Trying to think of other, Varun, feel free to jump in here.
No, I think you covered it a lot really well, Stephanie. I mean, it's a sprawling landscape of work, and that's great because that's what needs to be done. The only thing I will add is that I think what's been really heartening and what's been very powerful is that, so across the global network of GFI organizations, we've had actually countries at the ministerial level, at the ambassadorial level, etc., are taking a leading role and working with GFI organizations to advance this discourse. So we know, I mean, I think everyone who's involved in the smart protein sector knows that Singapore, Israel, these countries are seeing this sector as a key piece of their climate resilience, as well as economic development, food security, public health, all of that, right? So I think when we see folks from Israel representing alternative proteins as a key piece of all of this, that drives conversation and action a lot better. And we've seen this develop in other sectors as well, which I'm sure we'll get to in the rest of the conversation. And they represent that blueprint for how we can move forward. So that I think is the most heartening thing. And we hope that we can build a similar level of momentum and mission orientation in India.
Thanks for that, Varun and Stephanie, both for providing us that overview. Of course, Israel has, in its submission laying context to what Varun said, its submission at the UN FSS has specifically inserted language about alternative proteins being a key solution in how they're thinking about mitigating climate change. They're looking at reducing animal protein consumption to the levels that the Ministry of Health has recommended, and want plant proteins and sustainable alternative proteins as a key piece of how they're going to, satisfy protein demand in the next few years. So that's great to see. And of course, we hope that more and more countries will follow suit. And that's the kind of work that we're trying to do globally as well. I'll now move on to the next question. For this question, I'll move on to Claire. Claire, we have huge amounts of private and government resources dedicated to solutions like electric vehicles, while a slightly over 10 billion of private capital through Q3 2021, and very little development finance to date has been invested in alternative proteins. When I contrast this with a sector like renewable energy, we have 500 billion in renewable energy and 32 billion on public research in renewable energy alone, that was provided last year. And renewable energy, by the way, accounted for 30% of global electricity, which was up by 2% from 2019. So there's a 2% jump from 2019 to 2020, which is actually, if you think about it, huge. Um, Renewable energy has become quite ubiquitous now. And to think about that, say like 30 years earlier, that would have been very hard to see. And I think that's the kind of visual imagery that comes to my mind when I think about alternative proteins. It gives us that playbook to draw learning from. And considering that we don't really have time, we are facing the effects of climate change as we speak. We need to act on it fast. So, could you offer some learnings for us from other sectors like renewable energy or any other sectors that you have personally tracked, on how we can view smart protein as a climate technology?
Yeah, I think electric vehicles and renewable energy is a really good comparable example, because this technology was around for a while before we started to see the huge amounts of private and government resources into these technologies that we do see now. In the US, investments into renewables really started to ramp up in around the 1970s, after the oil crisis, frankly, really scared folks and also fueled this desire to be energy independent. I'm hoping we don't need an acute crisis like that in the meat industry to really scare folks into shifting more quickly into smart proteins. Hopefully, the increased awareness around the climate crisis we face generally and globally will be sufficient to push focus to this promising and necessary sector. I also think that the more investors and governments realize how much this sector is also wrapped up in a nation's food independence, the more support we'll start to see flowing. And I also think, to your point about the pretty big jump from 2019 to 2020, I think is reflective in some ways to just how cheap and how much more cost effective those technologies are getting. And I think as the smart protein sector gets closer and closer to that, as the Good Food Institute loves to say, as they more and more taste the same or better or cost the same or less, I think as we get closer on that, I also think that investments will increase exponentially. And I also think we need, and we started to see this in renewables as well, we need so much more increased awareness around this space, which I'm preaching to the choir here, and Maya touched on the importance of this. Stephanie mentioned that historically alternative proteins have been neglected in climate negotiations. The more awareness we can grow around all that this sector holds, the sooner I think we'll see increased investments flow. So much of both the general public and potential investors still just don't know very much about smart protein as a sector, and that it is absolutely necessary technology in the fight for climate change. And I think similar to renewable energy, electric vehicles, as awareness increases of these two realities, so too will investments. And we're seeing this in the DFC. You know, this is new to the DFC. More folks in the DFC are learning about this. Good Food Institute is helping us to increase awareness even within the agency. And I think the more we see this, the more investments will flow.
Thanks for that, Claire. Maya, I also want to, for the next question, zoom into the ongoing work that you're doing with the Climate Capital Network. Claire mentioned how the investment community broadly is learning about this right now, learning about this technology, and you're doing incredible work right now setting up this Climate Capital Network, and it's still ongoing. So we'd love to get some early insights, a sneak peek on the profile of players that are becoming a part of this network, or potential candidates that you are targeting here. What stages are they really coming at in the industry from early to late? Do you see that there are any gaps right now in this chain? Broadly, we would just be interested to know what the emerging scenario looks like for climate finance in India.
Sure. So the Climate Capital Network, as you rightly mentioned, is something that we are in the process of building. It's a fairly new network, and Green Artha essentially launched the network because as we've been speaking to more and more funders in the climate space, and we think of climate very broadly, so we think of everything that is within climate and adjacent to climate as being important. Climate basically sits on top of everything. As we speak to people, it's becoming more and more apparent to us that there's lots of great work happening, but people are generally working in silos. Not everyone is aware of who else is out there. Everyone is calling out for this need for collaboration and co-funding, a continuum of funding, but it's not clear to most people how to make that happen. And so that was really kind of I would say the genesis of the formation of the Climate Capital Network. It's a network of capital allocators looking at the climate space. And, we've been quite considered about why we use those terms. So capital being very broad, we look at people who deploy grant, equity, debt, and everything in between. And this is very intentional. The climate space in India is very nascent. And we know that we're going to need all three forms of capital plus other types of innovative instruments to really bring everything up to speed as fast as it needs to be. And capital and climate, as I said, also as broad as possible, because as I said, again, it's something that we believe sits on top of everything. To come to your more specific question about who are the members right now it's a really broad swathe of people who are looking at this space. And it goes all the way from large foundations and philanthropies to people who are very early stage investors, people who have only recently added a climate lens to their work, and people who have recently added a climate mandate to their work. So I think what's very heartening for us is that so many people are now saying that climate is a very critical part of how they are viewing investments. But also more and more people were saying that now we need to understand climate and have, just a separate vertical to focus on it. We have people who understand, and I think you've had many of these people actually on previous panels who understand many nuances of smart protein, for example. And then we have people who are really learning about it. I think what's interesting is that there are many, many people who are now joining the network saying, we're interested in the space. We know that we really need to educate ourselves. We have people coming in from the angel investment side. And I do see that that's, I think, a very heartening sort of progression, because really these are the people who will potentially help seed early innovations. What we need at the early stage is obviously, significant amounts of high-risk capital, some of which could be through angel investors, some of which could be through grant funding. And then we need the entire continuum of funding to come in and support. And that's really kind of one of the roles of the network, to bridge some of those gaps and to try and bring people together to see where there are opportunities.
Thanks so much for that, Maya. I just have like a quick, question for Varun here, because you mentioned that there are, different types of capital, different stages of capital that can come in, and of course, you have these kinds of profiles that you're looking at, but really from the other end, what is the kind of capital that will benefit the larger sector right now? Maya mentioned early stage would be really useful. But to you, are you really looking at this space and seeing that, this type of capital is what I am targeting or what we would like to see?
Yeah, great question. I mean, look, we're operating in India, Satvika, so I think you know this at least as well as I do. We really need to do all things all the time from the ground up in a new market. You framed this really well at the beginning of this conversation, where you said India and countries like it are among the most vulnerable to climate change in the world, right? So I don't think we can wait for pure market forces to develop a market here and then wait for early stage investment to lead to later stage rounds and then eventually development finance institutions and infrastructure funding. And that's a very long life cycle of the development of an industry. As Claire and Maya and Stephanie have all said, other industries, and you said, other industries offer a blueprint or a playbook here, but they took decades to develop. Claire brought this up earlier, that solar had got to a point where it was cheap enough that now $500 billion of investment in the space is because it's hit certain inflection points, right? I think to Maya's point, we need capital that is taking greater risks to develop this from the ground up and give it an accelerated path to scale. So I would say right from very, very early stage investment, incubation, acceleration, which is not just capital, but also an ecosystem, right? All the way through to growth stage capital. And by the way, just an insight here, when GFI was originally working as a global network, when we originally got started, there were a lot of companies that needed early stage capital. And then when some of those companies emerged as sort of rock stars in these categories of cultivated meat and fermentation derived proteins, etc., the question very quickly became, how will some of the larger investors view this and invest in the space, right? So I think we had to then shift our focus to briefing some of those larger investors and making sure that we can get them to the table, because the kinds of capital that you need is very different when you're setting up a manufacturing facility, etc. So the answer to your question for India, South Africa, is all things from the ground up, and that involves a lot of painstaking ecosystem building and stuff like that. I think we are extremely grateful that folks like Maya and Starlene are setting up the Climate Capital Network, because that gives us an ecosystem into which we can plug, right? And grateful that Claire and other, Claire, USDFC and other development finance institutions or multilateral organizations are beginning to take the space seriously, or Claire's at least going to try to take the space seriously. And then we can essentially plug that capital in as soon as it is needed, rather than wait around for it. So I think there's a lot of work to do, and I'm very glad we're having this conversation so we can move to action as soon as it's needed.
Thanks so much for that. I think that gets us to a good pivot to the next set of questions. Claire, from your initial explorations and discussions with companies in the smart protein space, or in the related space, which areas of growth have you identified for investment readiness? Varun mentioned that, of course, climate by itself in isolation is not going to work right now, because this is a very nascent industry. So where do you see other players coming in to supplement your efforts as an investment institution?
Yeah, and I'll say at the top that, in this conversation around where the gaps are, the DFC can come in earlier than some traditional investors and lenders are typically ready or comfortable to, but after those angel investors that are willing to get in at that very early stage. Maya mentioned early stage is still a gap. The DFC cannot directly yet fill this very early stage. We typically need to see 2 to 3 years of financials from a company for us to analyze. So in the smart protein space, so far, this has focused pretty exclusively on crops needed for plant-based foods. Mainly pulses is what we've been able to support. Given how new some of the tech still is in this space, we haven't received many applications from companies with this kind of track record that we need to see. That said, we can support other investors that can come in at this early stage, and impact investment funds are a really good example of this. The DFC can invest into these funds, historically only debt, but now, as I mentioned earlier, we have this equity tool that is new to us. So we can also provide equity into funds. We can also provide partial credit guarantees to these funds, either on those underlying investments or at the investor level itself, which can really help protect investors' capital and help a fund to attract those investors. The DFC can also finance feasibility studies and technical assistance, which could be very helpful tools for those more early stage companies in this space. And I'll just wrap up with a similar vein to what I mentioned earlier, and it's come up from other speakers now as well, is just as we have more awareness around this space and institutions like the DFC see the demand, I think that's a crucial part of increasing this awareness, is for institutions like the DFC to be hearing from companies in this space or impact investment funds in this space about the demand. And as we learn of more players in this space, as we receive more applications, we improve our ability to analyze the credit risk more appropriately, and we can increase our own outreach to players and become more active in this space and increase awareness. That's why I'm so glad to be on this panel. I'm so glad to partner with the Good Food Institute and that they're helping us with this. And I think if there are folks in this call that are either investment ready or they know impact investment funds that could use support like this, please reach out to your contacts at the Good Food Institute. They can introduce you to me. I can drop my email in the chat, but we really need a lot of help to see more of the demand and where the players are that need this kind of DFC support.
Thanks so much for your partnership and your support, Claire. I'd be sure to share these details. I think we'll make sure that the Indian startups also know about what DFC is doing and the kind of companies that you're likely to support here. Maya, I'd like to move on to you for the next question. We're seeing encouraging investment activity from climate-aligned investors, such as a recent investment by sustainability-focused Peak Ventures in plant-based ingredients company Proyon. But there's still gaps that need to be bridged through complementary action from other actors to nurture innovation and make these companies investment ready. What perspective can you offer on supporting actors who can play a role here?
So I think Varun has talked quite a lot about this, and so I think he stole many of my points. But I'm going to jump in any case and kind of list out what I think is still needed. I'm going to not talk about climate finance because I think we've talked about that. But really critically, at the end of the day, when any investor is looking at a company, it needs to be feasible and viable as a business. And so there are many pieces that come in before that, and in order for that to happen. And for example, for that company to get to a point where someone like Claire or organizations at that level can come in and support. So it's all of the pieces before that. Obviously, when we're thinking about smart protein, this is science. This is deep science, and we have some great labs. Bioreactor does great work in India, but we need more labs. We need both government and we need private labs. It would be fantastic if we could get more corporates also to enable some of this R&D to happen, because at the end of the day, I think corporate support can also help take some of these innovations to scale and to the market much faster than an individual or a small innovator. So that's one enormous piece, I think, around just kind of the R&D. This is a piece that Varun has called out in previous conversations with us, and that we've also found is that, again, because this is actual sort of innovation and R&D, we need better infrastructure. There are entire pieces of machinery that don't exist in India or are just too expensive. And that's another space of both a gap and an opportunity. So there are people on this call who are wondering how they can actually support and enable this ecosystem. I feel like that's an important place to plug in. And then finally, I think a large space of support is this big thing that we call incubation and acceleration. And the role of incubation and acceleration is very simple. It's taking kind of an innovation and an idea that is very early stage and providing it with everything around that takes the idea and makes it a business. And I think that is really critical. It's we have great technologists, but not all of them have the background that enable them to build a business. So that input, I think, is really critical. Finally, we need to move these things fast. Everyone over here on the call has called out the fact that this needs to move faster than it is. So there needs to be something done that is a little bit more catalytic around market creation. Market creation happens, but it happens slowly, and maybe we don't have enough time for that. And so we might need some acceleration around getting the awareness out there, from the perspective of both customers, corporates, consumers, and investors and government on why this particular area needs to be supported better.
Great framing, by the way. I think the fact that all these players need to come together to ensure that we're getting a consensus building, we're creating awareness about the need for this and to accelerate this is crucial. Which is why we need, and we've been talking about this in the last few days, to focus on this in a mission mode almost. For my next question to Stephanie. I want to ask about the early signs that we're seeing with a few public development banks that are stepping into this space, such as the European Investment Fund, which is invested indirectly through Blue Horizon Ventures, but there's still a lot to be done to build further capacity. We already talked about it a little bit with Maya and with Varun, but if you have any other insights on how we can engage institutions so that smart protein companies are taken as viable investment targets within the existing climate conversations. And of course, this would mean that there is some bit of preparation and there's a bit of mindset shift that companies also have when they're talking to institutions. So how do they better engage with institutions to communicate this urgency and to be seen as serious candidates for investment?
So as Claire pointed out, DFIs or development finance institutions are not really set up to invest in the earliest stages. For the most part, there are some development finance institutions that have kind of lab branches. So the lab is like the experimental side of a bank, of a development bank, where they're willing to take a little bit of a risk, and also a smaller investment. So we have been engaging with a few of those groups. For instance, at the Inter-American Development Bank, that seems to be the part of the bank that is most interested in our sector at this point, just because the investments required to scale the industry are not as large as most of the investments that these banks are looking to make. So that is a promising area that we're exploring, is wherever there's a lab division of a bank, we're trying to engage with those. And I'm leading our work. It's just at the very beginning stage, but we are engaging with development finance institutions all across the world. We interestingly had very, I think, promising engagement with the IDB, where they asked us to take a look at an investment in Argentina, a plant protein processing facility that they were asked to go in on as a partner with some private investors. And they're taking a serious look at that. So they already understand that alternative proteins are a great climate solution and can help de-risk their portfolio. Their portfolio is also very heavily invested in animal agriculture. So they're looking to de-risk that. because everybody knows that animal agriculture is a risky investment. It's increasingly risky, and banks are looking to de-risk that. So alternative proteins are actually a perfect investment for banks that are heavily invested in animal agriculture. I would say that as we see companies advance beyond the startup phase and have solid track records, they'll be sufficiently mature to attract financing from divisions of banks that are beyond the lab level. So we're looking at connecting, using our networks internationally. We're connected with fairly high level policymakers across all of our geographies. And, it's important to engage those folks to help them understand the value proposition, because they work very closely with the development finance institutions when these investments are made. So we're looking to kind of leverage those connections that we have, or the relationships that we have, let's say in Brazil, in their Ministry of Agriculture, or in Singapore with all of the government connections that we have there, to work on projects in, let's say, South America. And I think that as we have a project in the Amazon where we are researching indigenous crops as potential so looking at their potential to contribute protein, and as we advance that research, to use those crops in the Brazilian value chain and throughout South America, and with those indigenous crops, they will be benefiting smallholder farmers. So the smallholder farmers will be able to plug into the ecosystem. And likewise, this work will then benefit the local manufacturers, who no longer have to import expensive pea protein from Europe or so, and will then make those products cheaper. So I hope we are able to, once this project really has started to bear fruit, I think we'll be able to use that as a case study for other development finance institutions, where they see that this isn't just an industry that's going to benefit developed countries, but it will benefit people all across the world, in developing economies, middle income economies, and developed economies.
Thanks for that, Stephanie. And I think the point that you mentioned about it having multifold impact across, nutrition security, across farmer livelihoods, across food security, I think all of that is important to keep in mind, because those would be the kind of, impact metrics that you would like to capture when you're conversing with, impact investors, especially. So I think and I mentioned this in our earlier panels as well, it's hard to decouple all these different impact areas when it comes to smart protein, because of course it extends beyond just, supplying food. It's about how you're impacting the soil itself, how you're impacting somebody's livelihood. So yeah, thanks for bringing that up. For my last set of questions, and I know we don't really have that much time, but I'd really like to focus us on the path to 2070. Claire, I'd start with you. The Indian government has committed to achieving the target of net zero by 2070, along with other commitments such as reduction of total projected carbon emissions by 1 billion tons from now till 2030. It has also called upon developed countries to provide climate finance of 1 trillion US dollars. How does this influence the investment strategies of the development finance institutions towards developing nations such as India? Does that really change the sentiment that they've had and their plans broadly towards climate finance for India?
Yeah, this is huge. Having willing government partners is crucial for the DFC. Our investment strategy is centered on partnering with the host country everywhere we work. So having India have these ambitious goals and call for this support is really helpful and beneficial to giving us the momentum we need to do that. And we actually recently, the US and India agreed to what's called a US-India Climate and Clean Energy 2030 partnership. And this partnership elevates the ambitious climate actions as a core theme of US-India collaboration and supports the achievement of India's ambitious goals. You mentioned a few. This one specifically calls out the goal of reaching 450 gigawatts of renewable energy by 2030. And so the partnership currently has a lot of focus around clean energy deployment. I hope we can see smart proteins get in there as time goes on. But smart proteins already contribute to the partnership's goal around reducing greenhouse gas emissions. I think we maybe just need to increase awareness around smart proteins do that. So we hope to see a lot more of that in the partnership moving forward.
Thanks. And very quickly, Maya, to Claire's point about really increasing the breadth of how climate investments are viewed to food systems. How does this really shape domestic investor activity in climate investments and the breadth now, like I was saying, that it could now cover to include emerging climate resilient food systems?
So I'll very quickly answer that. And I think I'd like to jump on the point that Claire made, which is that investors really see this as, is there a viable business? But the moment the government is really on board with the fact that smart protein is a solution, then I think it just makes the market much bigger and much more viable, and it makes the market much more interesting from both an investor and from an entrepreneur perspective. So I think in my mind, the pieces are there. It's that communication and that sort of linking what smart protein does with what is considered climate resilience, which is a priority, with livelihoods, which is a priority, with water security, which is a priority. These connections just need to be drawn out a little bit more clearly, and then I think the path will become a lot easier.
Great, thanks for that. I think we have a lot of data in place. We should continue to collect that data, build that evidence base out, because I think a lot of you pointed out the information asymmetry that exists, the awareness that needs to, creation that needs to happen overall. And of course, we have a lot of data points. The LCAs are there. We know 1 in 3 beef burgers, if they're replaced with a Beyond Burger, it would be equivalent to getting 12.2 million cars off the road or powering 2.3 million homes. And that's like major impact at scale. It's the kind of impact without which we will not achieve our shared commitments under the Sustainable Development Goals, under the Paris Climate Agreement, or more recently COP26. And the best part is that for consumers, it's a simple switch. It's just lunch. So with that, I'd like to close, our panel for today. I'd like to thank my wonderful panelists, Stephanie, Claire, Maya, for the valuable perspectives on how we can chart this future, where alternative sources of protein gain as much support as alternative sources of energy globally. And we cannot wait to build those partnerships to move forward in our mission for smart protein with all of you. Thank you so much for taking out the time.
Thanks, Artha.
Thank you.